The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute, and we were just working out a couple of technical details. We're delighted that you're joining us for the Meaningful Voices Book Club, and we're going to start in just a couple minutes, but first I want to go through some technical information for you. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, check to make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. And if you're having technical problems, I recommend you exit the webinar, return to the link in the email, and then try to connect again, because sometimes that will help. All the audience members are muted throughout the presentation, but we would love to hear from you, and we would love to have you interact with the speakers. So if you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. You can submit the questions anytime during the presentation. If you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, and that will expand the feature options. So there's a little picture there. So tonight we have three people joining us to discuss our book, Lived Through This. Roger Canoff is a practicing attorney who has devoted his legal career to the eradication of violence against women and children, first as an assistant Commonwealth attorney in Alexandria, Virginia, and then as a special victims ADA in the Bronx, New York, and as an assistant attorney general with the state of New York. With more than 10 years' experience, he's prosecuted cases involving sexual and physical abuse against children and adolescents, and also sexual assault against adults, the elderly, and persons with disability. And Roger is featured in one of the chapters of Lived Through This, called The Good Man. Ann K. Ream is the author of Lived Through This and the founder of the Voices and Faces Project and co-founder of Stories We Tell, a testimonial writing program for survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and trafficking. She's also a national co-chair for the Counterquo, a U.S.-based initiative created to challenge the legal and media response to violence against women. And then lastly, we have Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, who is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's written extensively on sexual violence, clergy misconduct, and her work is considered foundational in addressing the issues of sexual and domestic violence within both faith communities and secular advocacy organizations. So those are the people we have with us today. Unfortunately, Anne does not have a webcam, but she is here. So I'm going to pass this off to you, Marie.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you particularly to Ann and Roger for joining us tonight for this conversation. I've really been looking forward to this. And I wanted to begin with you. You gave me this book when it first came out, and I remember our talking about it and the project that it represented for you, and being very excited and impressed by it. But what I want to confess to you tonight is that I did not want to read this book. And in fact, I didn't read it at that time. I skimmed it. I wanted to make sure I knew what you were doing with it. I didn't want to read it. And I realized, thinking back on that, that for me, part of it was not wanting to hear more stories from survivors. And I think that's one of the things I'd like us to talk a little bit about tonight in terms of the telling of stories and the hearing of stories as we interact with one another around this. So anyway, but having read it in preparation, once we decided we were going to use it for the book club, I was delighted. And having now read it, I'm delighted to have read it. It's really an exceptional piece, and reminded me again what an excellent writer you are, but also what you've done with this piece is, I think, very, very important. And I keep thinking of ways that this book can be a resource in our efforts to train clergy, particularly in chaplaincy roles, in being better prepared to respond to victims and survivors. So the quote that I pulled from you in your introduction is on the screen now, and I wanted to kind of start with that. You said, "The sharing of a story, especially a story of having survived rape or sexual abuse, is inherently an act of faith in the listener. We do not testify to our experiences because it is healing, although it can be, but because it is necessary in a world that too often underestimates the scope and scale of sexual violence. The women and men in these pages are believers in the power of testimony and in the power of you, meaning the reader. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that dynamic between the testifier, the survivor in these stories, and the receiver, the reader, those of us who are listening and hearing, and to use Judith Herman's terms, the bystander in receiving that information, but also that experience. Can you do that?
Yeah, and thank you, Marie, for being so honest about your response to the book. That moves me very much, actually. And I think I've heard that before from people, that sense that they understand how important these stories are and how important this issue is. But it's a very human instinct to want to turn away, in some cases, from pain and trauma and people's grief, certainly the grief of people we love. So it's because it's so painful to get close to what they've suffered through. So I appreciate you being honest about that. And I love the question, because for me, this book was always, in a certain sense, about connecting audience to the testifier. And what I would hear and see over and over again as I would listen to the stories of survivors was that they had a deep hunger for justice, but even larger than that hunger for justice, I believe this deeply, larger than the hunger for justice even, is the hunger to be heard, because there actually is a form of justice in being heard. That there's the acknowledgement of being able to look someone in the eye and to say, this is my experience. I want to bring you closer to my experience. And when I feel and see you understanding my experience, some degree of my pain recedes. And I was fascinated by not only people's sort of broad hunger to be heard, but also their desire to be seen and known as individuals who'd been shaped by the violence and trauma that they lived through, but that were and are not exclusively defined by it. That it wasn't enough for, and I don't think it is enough in most cases, for survivors to be able to say, let me tell you about this traumatic experience or event or series of events, or let me talk to you about the most painful aspect of my story. There was also a hunger to say, I am greater than that trauma. And I want you to understand the totality of who I am as a person. And when I went into the project, you know, in many cases, for example, I mean, one of the joys of profiling someone like Roger, who is a friend, I didn't know Roger's story. I knew Roger for a very, very long time as a gifted prosecutor and a lovely person, and did not know anything about the fact that he was a survivor of violence. And so what I wanted to do with each of these individuals in the book was to be able to bear witness to who they are as people, but also to be able to look at them in some cases over the course of 3 or 5, or in a handful of those cases, you know, the full 10-year scope of the project, and be able to help craft a profile that they felt was representative of their story. I also saw early on that if you're a careful observer as a writer and as a documentarian, in some cases you will be able to see aspects of the individuals you're profiling that they may or may not see in themselves. And you're also, you know, have the privilege of observing and listening to a broad range of survivors in the U.S. and across the globe. So I sought to sort of draw connections between those forms of experiences. But for me, the there was a recognition that the stories had power when they were heard, that the reader and storyteller, in a sense, were in a codependent relationship, in the best, if there can be a positive sense of codependency. And that part of my task was to be able to bring those audiences together in a way that both did justice to the survivor, and then at the same time actually challenge the reader. Didn't just say to the reader, I want to break your heart. You know, that's just not enough. I wanted to move people, but I also wanted to compel people to act. And I always felt with the project that there was a balance between truth and hope, that I wanted to speak to the truth of these extraordinary people I had profiled and what they'd gone through, which was, you know, heart-crushingly painful, and then also show that by their very existence and their tenacity and their willingness to give testimony, to testify to their own experiences, that was inherently a hopeful act. I know that's a very long answer.
No,
but you know me, Ray. Sometimes I do the long answer.
No, thank you very much. Roger, I want to move to your kind of take on this in terms of the ways in which you share your story. Do you also have faith in the listener that Anne states, and if so, and how do you experience that in terms of what do you expect from us as the reader or the listener to your story?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know if I've ever thought of it that way. I think I've been really, really lucky in that I have always expected and I have always experienced that people who hear my story will be gracious and open-hearted and open-minded, and that's honestly that's what I've experienced. But perhaps that spoiled me, and it's so interesting because you know, as a lifelong DA, as a lifelong prosecutor, my job was to absorb these stories and to translate them into testimony and into legal proceedings and things of that nature. And I thankfully, I think I sort of instinctively had some good skills. And I was also taught, I benefited greatly from the wisdom of others in terms of doing that in a compassionate way. And I can proudly say, before it was standard. You know, now we have developed, when I say we, I mean the community of prosecutors, law enforcement, advocates, just the responders out there who have sort of developed the modern way of dealing with survivors. We have come up with something, I think, that is just much more powerful and much more compassionate and much more compelling. But even before that, I am grateful that I was able to generally, at least I think, work with survivors in a way that was compassionate and that was positive to them. And I guess, going back even a step further, I think a lot of that is because the response to my victimization for the very small group of people I shared it with was so positive. I got really, really lucky. So in terms of what I expect from listeners, from hearers, it's hard to say. I mean, I hope for compassion. I hope for open-mindedness. I hope for, if not empathy, I certainly hope for sympathy. And I can honestly say that's what I have almost always received. So, yeah, I don't know. It's I'll have to think about it a little bit more. It's a great question, but I guess the short answer would be I believe in tone and mood. You know, I think what the teller puts out is tone. I think if I'm not confusing that from high school, and what the hearer or the reader or the listener gets, you know, what they sort of experience is mood. So I would like for those to be as equal as possible, I suppose. But yeah, I guess that's the way I see it. I hope for the kind of response that I actually got, and maybe that makes me just a really, really almost Pollyanna, you know, almost just a very, very lucky person.
Now, as you had described, as Anne describes your experience in that chapter, I was thankful that you did have a response that was supportive and compassionate when you began talking about your experience. And we'll get into this more as we go along in terms of what we all, want to see happen in terms of education awareness and changing people's way of dealing with these issues. But I did want to begin with that point. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah. This was the quote from Dorothy Allison's chapter that particularly struck me. Look at your life as a story and revise it, Dorothy tells me. This is in your voice, Anne. Write yourself a new ending because you don't have to be what they tell you you're going to be. Anne, talk a little bit about the point at which you began to realize the power of the telling of the story, both for your own experience and for others.
Yeah, I have to say, that was such, Dorothy's, that statement to me was such a summary of something I felt so deeply through my own experience. It's interesting, I was recently rereading Joan Didion, and in her book of essays, The White Album, she has what's now a rather famous quote, "We tell ourselves stories so we know how to live," which I think is another version of what Dorothy is saying. And I felt that very strongly in my own experience, that I felt a deep desire to be able to take this experience that one part of me, just as someone who believes deeply in challenging injustices, a strong part of me felt that there was something so fundamentally wrong and unjust, that there is something so fundamentally wrong and unjust about experiencing violence, that there was no possible way I could reframe it in a way that would make it okay. And in fact, I believe that. I don't think I can ever make it okay.
Right.
But what I wanted to do was to take this experience that never should have happened, should never happen to anyone, and to assign meaning to it in my own life, to be able to say, I would never wish for this. I would not, of course, wish this on anyone. But I want to be able to articulate my experience and reflect on that experience in a way that brings me closer to other people's pain, and that can help further, at the risk of sounding too lofty, further public understanding of what gender-based violence, gender-related violence is and what it does to people. And so I understood. It was interesting at the time that I was assaulted, I was actually working on homeless issues. That was, and still is, something I'm very passionate about, and was doing a lot of work around those issues. And having gone through this experience, I saw how I experienced firsthand the dynamic of being a rape victim, moving with a case that's in the criminal justice system, dealing with the reality of people's responses to me. And I all of a sudden realized that I had been made an authority on this issue. I had an authority I'd never sought and never wanted. But in fact, I had the authority. And I also, have the writerly tendency to want to observe. And so I observed myself in that system. I kind of observed the way people responded to me, and then at the same time I observed the way people responded to others, and became very interested in this way in which, your testimony is your own truth, but there's a broader testimony, and the broader goal for me became, how could I share my story in a way that illuminated broader truth about sexual violence, about gender-related violence? How could I use my own story to open up a conversation where I didn't forget all of the untold stories? I love to read, not surprisingly for someone who's a writer, and I read, continually that the testimonies, whether it was, Dorothy Allison's, ironically, Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina was published the year I believe I was attacked. And that book provided a huge, she was such a hero for me that ultimately interviewing her and with Patricia photographing her and being able to really probe and understand her story, there was something sort of profoundly healing for me in that. But what I really became very passionate about was this, a desire to not only to use my story as a window into a broader world and to not stay in the zone of my own testimony, because I was very aware of the limitations of that.
So it sounds like that's your work that has come from that is the new ending that she's referring to in terms of writing yourself a new ending.
Yes, I mean, that's a beautiful way to put it, Marie. I mean, I think that one of my great fears was that, and I think in listening to the other survivors' stories, I think it's a fear that's fairly constant. At that time particularly, names were never used, faces were blotted out, people didn't talk about this issue, people didn't identify as survivors. I was working in Washington, D.C. at that time for a grassroots lobbying firm, and I would look around the room at all these, extraordinary, talented, gifted, particularly at that point, women who were in my life, and think, if I just knew that one of you had gone through this and had still become what you are, I would breathe a huge sigh of relief, knowing that perhaps for me it would be okay. And my great fear was, and I think this is the fear of many people who survive trauma, violence, loss, any sort of event that's life-altering, is that it will be the beginning of a downward spiral, that you won't be able to reconstitute your life, that you'll look back at your life and say, that was the beginning of a shift into a space I could never pull myself out of, that the world didn't support me, I should say, in emerging from. And so for me, her saying, you don't have to be what they tell you you're going to be, was incredibly powerful, a reminder that we are constantly in our actions and in our lives redefining and rewriting our own stories. But also I think what I saw in Dorothy, and I've seen in many of these survivors, and I feel compelled to say this whenever I talk about the people I interviewed for this book, I don't know a single person I interviewed who did this alone, who did it successfully alone, I should say.
Right.
And that everything from their communities of faith, their families, their intimate partners, their support networks, social services, scratch the surface on people who have been able to reconstitute their lives. And there very often is a deep and rich network. And part of my ultimate goal with the book was to remind the world, these stories don't happen in a vacuum. We are responsible for one another. And that particularly when we look at communities of faith, it's striking the times you hear survivors talk about their clergy getting it right, and the times their hearts are just broken when the clergy gets it wrong. How huge and outsized an effect that has on them.
Right. Yeah, we're gonna get to that specifically in just a minute in terms of the importance of that. Roger, how about for you in terms of revising your story, or how do you feel like you relate to what Dorothy said?
I loved that story. I mean, and it was, and she just puts things so beautifully and so concisely. I agree. You don't have to be what they tell you you are going to be. But again, my experience was different in that, first of all, what happened to me happened when I was so young, which of course, millions of people experience this. Most kids who experience child sexual abuse tend to experience it, I guess, differently than many adults who experience rape, or only because the dynamics are different. Of course, I'm not making any statements or judgments about the level of trauma or any of that stuff, but the dynamics can be different, I guess, between what kids experience, which is usually a grooming process, as opposed to what adults experience, which is usually something more blunt or something more sudden. So I think what surrounds the experience can be different. So for me, what I remember experiencing was just something that was strange, and it was there were times it was horrific, there were times it was very painful, there were times but it was always mysterious, which is, I think, a different dynamic from somebody who is an adult, who is walking through the world as Anne was, who is self-possessed, who understands things, who all of a sudden, her life is very, very bluntly affected, and she suffers an attack. She suffers something very sudden and very violent and very different, and I think that changes everything. Obviously, it changes the narrative, it changes how you look at it, it changes the perspective. The trauma, I don't think, is different. Trauma is trauma, I believe that, but I guess the way you perceive it and the way you process it becomes different because of that. So for me, it was when I think about it, I think about something that I think about an experience, the definition of which emerged in a cloudy kind of way. It was sort of something that I was drawing from shadows, and it wasn't until I was an adolescent that I could even really describe it. And then I chose to relate it to some young men that I grew up with, who I was very close to, who, thank God, reacted in a very, very positive way. But that, I think, is a different way of relating it. I think it's a different way of experiencing it than other people do, women and men who have been, whose trauma came about in a different way. I hope that makes sense anyway.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Anne writes about in your chapter is your encounter, I think it was with another prosecutor who made a comment following I guess you got a conviction on a young man who had been sexually abused as a child. Do you remember what I'm referring to?
I do, yeah. I do.
And I was struck by that. Could you reiterate that for our listeners? And for me, that was one of the ways that you have rewritten your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if it's what I'm thinking of, if it's from the chapter, if it's what I'm thinking of, I know there was the prosecutor I was talking to, she didn't mean anything by it. She didn't know better.
Right.
But I think, if I remember it correctly, it was she was meeting with a young man, and she had, she remembered him from a previous case. And I remember her telling me, I was walking into her office and he was just leaving, and they were, they hugged and they had a nice goodbye. And I said, who was he? And she said, she said, he was a young man I worked with. He was sexually abused by a teacher. And went on for years, was really horrific, and she was explaining the case, and I said, and she said, yeah, I gotta be honest though, I feel kind of uneasy about what he wants to do. And I said, well, what does he want to do? And she said, well, he wants to be a teacher. And I said, oh, well, that sounds great. She's like, yeah, but you know how it is. I mean, he was a victim of something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if he turns around and wants to do it to somebody else. And it was just a terrible, terrible thing to hear. It isn't true. I mean, we know now that that's a very cool myth, but she didn't know, and I certainly don't blame her for it at all. But how did it make me feel? It was horrible. I mean, that was an absolute silencing. Okay, dear God, and make sure no one ever. That was a really, really. It was just an unfortunate thing. I certainly don't blame her for it, but in terms of how it made me feel, I don't think anything has ever made me feel worse other than the acts themselves. I can't think of, but again, that's one of the things you go through. It just is.
Yeah. But I heard that in this quote from Dorothy, that in the work that you've done and your professional life, that you don't have to be what they tell you you're going to be.
Exactly.
And again, I think for the power of that in survivors sharing their stories is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. And it's fun. I'm glad that you pointed that out because I honestly I hadn't been thinking of it in that way. But that's so important, particularly for male survivors. I think that's very the idea that you won't be predatory. That's very, very important. So thank you.
Yeah. So let's go on to the next one. And just for our listeners, we're using these slides just to sort of organize our conversation and kind of an outline to walk us through some of the issues that are raised in Anne's book. This is reference to the Royal Commission into the Institutional Response to Child Sexual Abuse in Australia, which is a very big deal in Australia, which I think is remarkable. They put an incredible amount of resources and time into actually carefully examining what has gone on in the history of Australia around the sexual abuse of children, particularly who've been in institutional settings, whether those have been religious or secular institutions. And one of the things they spend a lot of time doing is listening to survivors. And I thought that this is from one of their latest reports, and I thought it reiterates much of what, Anne, you're doing in the work that you do with survivor stories. The quote from the report is, "There's a great need for many survivors to be able to tell their story," Mr. Reed, the commissioner, said. "The Royal Commission acknowledges the courage of those people who've shared their story. Many survivors have told us that sharing their story has helped with their healing process. Every story helps the Royal Commission develop practical recommendations for change. So far, the Commission has conducted 5,000 private sessions with individual survivors, where they've invited people to come forward and meet with a member of the Commission and share their story, and the Commissioner is there to hear it. Now, and they're not done yet. But one of the things that I find about this, and I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on, is we're back to the relationship between the teller and the hearer. But in this case, within this institutional setting, the importance of a Royal Commission for the country being available to people to come and tell their story to, in this case, someone who matters in a significant institutional role of leadership, and hopefully then what will come beyond that based on what the information they're gathering. But I'm interested from each of you in terms of your sense of the importance of who that hearer is, and again, back to my early question about, and what do you expect us to do when we hear the stories of survivors? Anne, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's fascinating. When I have the slides, by the way, Marie, just so you know. When I was looking at this a few minutes ago, I was really compelled. One of the stories that didn't make it in the book simply because of timing, but one of my most moving experiences with the Voices and Faces Project was in partnership with Tear Fund. And I think you're familiar with Tear Fund. It's one of the largest NGOs in the world connecting communities of faith to pressing social justice issues. We partnered with them and the Voices and Faces Project traveled to South Africa, where Tear Fund had identified a community of survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence, and trafficking who were ready and, in fact, eager to share their stories not only with leadership from the Anglican Church, but also leadership from the African National Congress focused on gender justice issues. And this particular project was really a call to action for that political and religious leadership in South Africa, to the leaders who had effectively torn down apartheid, saying you need to invest in this issue. You need to fight for justice for women with the zeal with which you fought for racial equality. And many of these women, Tear Fund had brought together. Our role was to, I think we were there 10 or 11 days. We all immersed ourselves in the lives of the women. We all lived together in a home in Durban and really helped them think through how they wanted to share their stories, in what way they wanted to share their stories. Most of these women, I believe, had never shared their stories publicly. And certainly none of them had stood up in front of some of the most powerful figures in their country to share their stories with a call to action. And what I saw in that room when those leaders came into the room and these beautiful and courageous women walked into that room to share their stories, what I saw was them taking back, in some sense, their power. And that came from not only being afforded this important audience that was there to listen and learn from them, but it came from the quality of the listening and learning. It came from the way in which Tear Fund and our allies had said, had worked with leadership to say, this is not about us all coming together and shedding a tear over these injustices. It is about shedding a tear, and then it's about turning around and creating change. And the women, I think, really saw themselves not as testifiers only to their own experience, but they saw themselves carrying the water for the other story, for other women in their country. They saw themselves as part of a greater and larger mission, and that, I think, is part of what makes testifying effective. And I can imagine in this, when you talk about the Royal Commission, that a big piece of what made that powerful, you know, that notion that every story that was shared was helping the Royal Commission develop practical recommendations for change. That meant that that story sharing moved beyond personal or individual therapy and moved into the realm of personal power. And that is where I often see, I see survivors reclaiming power that may have been lost to them, or in some ways finding power in themselves they may not have ever known they had, which was quite moving.
Roger, do you have any thoughts on the commission work?
You know, I don't have, Anne, as usual, Anne is, just puts things so beautifully. I don't have much to add to that except just to underscore what you said, which is I agree. When it becomes clear that survivor accounts, survivor stories are fueling policy, that they're I should say influencing policy and action, then I agree with Anne. There's an even more joyful, wonderful thing happens, and that is that the survivors collectively and individually realize this isn't just healing me, this isn't just helping me, this is giving me power. I can't agree with that more. And the one thing I will say is that in 15 years or whatever, however long it was of me either consulting or prosecuting these cases, that was one thing that I noticed very early on, was that the ability to testify, win or lose, whether or not a conviction was obtained, excuse me, every survivor I've worked with who was able to testify achieved a marvelous, almost in every case, just an incredibly cathartic experience from that. And it wasn't about, are we going to get a conviction here? It was, or not even do they all believe me. It was just, I have power for the first time in my life. This guy is putting me under oath. He's asking me to look at a jury, and this means something. So I couldn't agree more, and I'm grateful to Anne for putting it that way.
Yeah, I think that the point about it, that this means something, this is something that we've tried to convey in our training with faith communities around sexual abuse by faith leaders, is the importance of listening and hearing the testimony, but also then being impacted to make changes that need to be made, and then the power that does have for the survivor who is able to be heard by their faith community, not just by anybody, but by their own faith community, in fact, where the abuse happened, but also that the leadership, the larger faith community, is willing and able to take this on and actually do something then with that information. And I think that's what the Royal Commission is finding as well in the way in which they're going about their work to do that.
So Marie, we have a comment from the audience talking about the activism regarding campus sexual assaults and how basically this is what young women and men are demanding from their institutions, is to be heard and to be recognized. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I think is very exciting in terms of, you know, silent no more, basically, in those particular settings. So let me take this just a slight tangent here in that regard and ask the two of you to respond to Lady Gaga's performance at the Academy Awards of the song that she and a colleague of hers wrote, Till It Happens to You. In terms of that forum, that witness in that kind of a setting with that kind of an art form, how did you, each of you, respond to that, both personally but also in terms of the work that you do?
You know, I have to say, I was so, the first thought I had when I watched that was what that might have meant. I can't imagine 25 years ago seeing that. And in fact, even, you know, 10 or 12 years ago when I first was playing around with the idea of this project, I remember one of my mentors who I admire greatly sort of cautioning me away from this idea of creating a space where survivors could come forward and share their real names and faces and stories. And I remember her saying to me, you know, the only way you can possibly do this, Anne, is if you can guarantee that no one's going to get hurt. And I remember saying, the only thing I can guarantee is people will get hurt. You know, when you're asking people to come forward and share their story, that's the nature of a social justice movement. You take individual risks for something greater and larger than yourself. But having said that, there was, you know, even, you know, 2 decades ago, there were so many barriers in place to people coming forward en masse and sharing their stories, that watching her not only sing that song and acknowledge her own experience with violence, but seeing that community of survivors step forward onto the stage was incredibly powerful. And what I love about acts like that is, I imagine, you know, I live in a major urban setting and I'm surrounded by people who are relatively sophisticated and engaged in human rights and social justice issues broadly. But when I travel for our project, and you travel to a community or a small town or a region, or you meet a family where you are quite certain no one has ever really had the courage to utter the word rape, or certainly to identify themselves as victims, what you realize when you see those mass media representations, and certainly the internet has opened much of this up as well, that people can be absolutely isolated in their own day-to-day lives, but now in ways that we did not see 20 or 30 years before, or even 10 or 15 years ago. People are able to be exposed to individuals who have lived through what they've lived through, who are refashioning their own lives, and that representation gives them hope. And there's beauty and power in that idea that when you share your own story, you're testifying to your own experience, but you're also saying to other people, A, you're not alone, and B, if I've been able to reconstitute my life, you can too. And so watching that, I felt a huge amount of hope, and a sense also that there's a whole other generation of survivor activists who would not, you know, I certainly see them at the Voices and Faces Project, where, you know, some of the younger women who are part of our project, I think, are shocked. They don't think anything that we did was, in fact, that radical or unusual. They can't really even imagine a time when you would be ashamed. That's not to say that those barriers don't still exist, but it's to say that, because they certainly do. But it's to say that there are spaces and places that where there has historically been greater silence that are being opened up, and when those spaces open up, slowly that bleeds into the rest of the world. I imagine 20 or 30 years from now, we'll look back on this conversation and say, what was so radical? What was so shocking about these stories? And it's the Reverend King reference to the arc of the universe, leading toward justice, I suppose. I really believe that.
Yeah. Well, we have another question here, Sarah, that I think is relevant to this part of the discussion. Do you want to read this?
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I had a little problem with my microphone there. So Karen says that survivors have an unasked for authority, as Anne says, but it can be a fine line perhaps. Does one's personal experience also make one biased, as some might have suggested to me? And how do you present your authority while avoiding the perception of being, quote, too involved or overly emotional because of your experience?
That's a great question. Well, and I think that's where, for me, I think that those who have publicly been identified with a trauma do carry a really unique burden. I mean, I sort of recognized that early on, that I, had my own experience, and of course I had some authority on that, but that if I was going to speak about this issue in any broader sense, I felt that it was, I felt that burden to know and understand this issue, not just through stories and testimony, but also through statistics and studies, and to be able to be as knowledgeable on the issue as possible, to be able to speak in personal terms when necessary, but to be able to pull back from that and speak about the issue in political terms. And I think for me, just as an individual, I'm a huge believer in reason and thought, and thinking critically about these issues, and recognizing that there are ways in which our own experiences and our own stories can blind us to broader truths. And I learned early on in talking about this issue to never say, I had no desire to say it at a certain point, all survivors feel, or as a survivor I feel. I've been very hesitant to use the language of as a survivor I feel, because for me, what I wanted to be able to say was, separate from my own experience, there are injustices we have to address, that ultimately there's an authority even greater than individual experiences, which is what is just and good and fair. And it is I think whoever asked the question, it's really, even the act of asking the question shows a deep understanding of the complexities of being someone who's lived through something personally, who goes into the world to be in some ways a more public spokesperson. And I think one of the best things we can do is recognize that we are in a complex zone, either perceptually or literally in some cases, and to be aware of the ways our experience opens our eyes to understanding issues, and perhaps the ways sometimes our experience creates barriers to understanding of the issue more broadly, and also understanding perspectives that challenge our worldview.
And yeah, and I think the other thing I hear in the question and the comment, which is very helpful, is it's the problem of the broader society's response. This is one of the problems of one of the listeners, or of listeners as a group, in terms of how people deal or don't deal with an individual experience, or with talking about this at all. I remember when I first began my work in this area many years ago, and I was young and naive and finding my way. And one of the things that someone asked me early on in one of the presentations I gave very blatantly was, you know, were you a victim of sexual violence? And I realized in looking back, I wasn't prepared for that question, but I got prepared real fast. And but what I realized was that, and what I finally, the response I finally incorporated when I was asked that question was, I'm not going to answer that question, because what I heard in the question at that time was a challenge to my authority either way. Either if I was a survivor, then I was biased and too involved. If I wasn't a survivor, what did I know? And either way, it was coming from a place of, we really don't want to hear about this.
Right.
and so I began responding to it by not answering it and explaining that to people. But thinking back on it now in the context of this conversation, I realized that that's about the context that we're still working towards, and even I hear it even in the question tonight, the perception of being too involved in this because this is really your experience. And what other experience do people make that kind of assumption about? You know.
Yeah, I think it is a really, I think you're saying, you know, you're sort of damned if you do or damned if you don't.
Exactly.
It's absolutely right. And it is infuriating because in the end, the fundamental, the question, you actually want to respond to that question, which is with a question, which is, why is that important to you?
Right, exactly.
You know, why
do you need to know that? Yeah.
And so you know, my sense with this issue, I think that we are very wed in this culture to certain forms of identification. So when you sit in different rooms, you will hear people say, you know, as a woman I feel, as a survivor I feel, as an athlete I feel. You know, and we want to kind of connect ourselves more closely to these issues, and in some cases in very legitimate ways. But I always wonder what the world would be like if we just simply said I feel or I believe. And if there are times and places where our own experience, which is incredibly important, is smaller than some fundamental sense of just belief in a set of values that we're carrying forward.
Roger, do you want to get in on that discussion?
No, again, I think you have both put it very, very beautifully. It is what it is. You know, and I agree that there is a damned if you don't situation, depending on who you're talking to. But you know, when you're facing that kind of a thing, the best thing to do is, I think, what you did, Dr. Fortune, which is, I'm not going to answer that, and here's why, because it's not going to produce anything relevant to the discussion.
And you talked about that some in your chapter about, as a prosecutor, how you kind of walk that line, and talking about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, well, as a DA, I just didn't share it at all, and some of that was because I just didn't think it was appropriate. Some of it was because I thought it could be, it could actually be hurtful to my career, which I think it probably would have been at a couple of places. But I guess, yeah, I mean, more than anything, I didn't approach a professional situation with personal background only because I didn't want to distract from what the person I was dealing with was going through. There's no comparing it. It's never appropriate to say, well, I'm sorry you went through that, but just so you know, well, actually, let me rephrase that. I think there are times where it's appropriate to share, but in those professional situations, it usually wasn't. So it just wasn't anything that sort of came in. Now, you know, approaching people differently, it can be very appropriate to say, as long as I'm not as long as I'm not attempting to create a hierarchy or to assert that what happened to me was better or worse, then yes, I think it is very appropriate. But in general, in my professional life, it wasn't something that came into it, and it's a shame because there could have been times where some personal sharing might have been beneficial and might have worked, but it just wasn't realistic in the circumstances I was dealing with.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting when I think back when I was first starting work on the book. You know, I have a handful of friends who are journalists, and I remember, you know, trying to enter into this book project from a position of, as much as I could, what I believed to be sort of pure neutrality, you know, meaning I would, you know, I would go into these initial interviews and I thought, this is not going to be about me, this is not going to be a dialogue, this is about, you know, creating a space where people feel safe to share their stories with me, but it's not about my own disclosure. And I realized at a certain point, and I've certainly seen this in our Voices and Faces Project testimonial writing workshop, that there are times when sharing one's own story, one feels so vulnerable that to be able to have someone you're sharing your story with say, I understand that, I too felt that, that's something I'm familiar with, that way of disclosing experience where the motive is a deeper connection and the desire to create understanding. I think we want to do that, and so I'm always in my own life sort of weighing in the back of my mind, why do I want to share at this moment, or why do I not want to share, and challenging myself on that.
Very true. I feel the same thing. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of this. I don't have a formula, but I have a set of, you know, I'm always sort of, there's a tape running in my head where I'm thinking through that, and I think we do need the courage to disclose, and we also sometimes need the courage to pull back and not, and let other people have that floor.
Absolutely, I agree. It's really circumstantial. It really just it just depends, and it doesn't necessarily. There aren't professional boundaries that necessarily can't be broken, whatever the profession is. I mean, for me, it was law enforcement. For others, it's therapy. You know, but yeah, I agree. It's very, or if it's just sharing, if it's just personal, it's very circumstantial.
Yeah.
I think, Anne, it's one of the things you do so well in your work and in your writing is I really appreciate the balance that you bring to that and the clarity that I've seen you use of choosing to share your story when it's not about you. And I think that, you know, reflects, you know, your having lived with this for a long time and, you know, worked with it and dealt with it and kind of where you are in terms of your life. And so you make some really good, wise choices about that. I think it's one of the things that when we work with faith leaders that it's very hard to teach people. And we often get the question from faith leaders about their own experience and should I or shouldn't I, you know, disclose this in a pastoral care situation or counseling situation. And it's very hard to teach that because, you know, it is a very, I think, delicate balance and can very easily then become about the faith leader and not about the survivor who's sharing their experience. And so finding that balance that I think that you have found is a challenge, but I appreciate how you model that for people.
Thank you, Marie. It's kind of you.
So let's go on and talk some more about, speaking of faith communities, which is certainly always on my agenda, as you know. And one of the things that I noted in reading the 18 stories that you share with us, Anne, in your book, at least 5 of those, there was an explicit reference to religious faith or religious leaders or institutions that were part of the person's experience, for better or for worse. Okay? And this one in particular kind of jumped off the page at me in terms of every wrong-headed cliche about survival that I've ever heard, and most of them unfortunately sound religious. There's a reason for everything. God wouldn't give you anything you can't handle. What doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, blah, 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 blah. You know, these are the kind of platitudinous responses that unfortunately I fear that we hear too often in our faith communities in response to someone finally sharing their experience. And so I wondered for the two of you, because Roger, you grew up in a Roman Catholic family, right?
I did, yes.
Active Roman Catholic, and you were United Methodist family?
Yeah.
I recall. So for both of you, in terms of your backgrounds, I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the role of faith in both your experiences, but now as you do the work, how do you see that at this stage?
Roger, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. And I'll be quick. I can tell you, first, I was very lucky. I was very lucky for a lot of reasons. One, I was around priests very closely. I was an altar boy. I grew up around them. I was in close quarters with them. They were personal friends with my mother and father. Never had a bad moment with a priest. I mean, they were decent, holy men. It was really funny. I mean, when I say funny, just because I have such fond and decent memories of them. And my parents were super liberal. They would have been hippies. They're too old, but they would have been hippies if they had been in the right generation. They were very, very liberal Catholics, and they helped build the parish that I was in. The point of all this is that the religious messages that I received as a kid were actually very positive, because my parents didn't go down that road, which is a very understandable road, by the way, which is pretty much all those things that you talked about, Doctor, the things about God wouldn't give you anything, or that Anne talks about, there's a reason for everything. These things tend to center around the just world theory. There are so many decent, honorable religious people who are desperate to believe in a just world. And of course, I didn't make up the just world theory. It's a common meme. But the idea is that for many, many religious people, they can't stand the idea that God is not in control. They can't stand the idea that a loving God would allow things to happen, bad things to happen to good people. So they come up with these platitudes. I never received those. My parents were much more about, they were just about, look, God is love, but it's not a love that we can always understand. It's hard to explain, and it wasn't easy to explain to me as a kid, but I can honestly say my mother and father are wonderful people. They're not perfect, of course, but in that regard, and not only them, but the religious leaders that I looked up to as a kid were very, very positive for me, because as I was going through the questions in the dark times, I never said to myself, and I know many people I have worked with professionally and personally, who did struggle with that, who did struggle with well, why? I've been taught for so long that there's a God that's looking out for me. There's a Jesus, or a being, a thing that loves me so much. How could this have happened? And that was never promised to me. A loving God was promised to me, but not in the way that I think many really, really decent people expect. And that's something that I dealt with professionally too, and I still do. Not only with survivors and victims in the legal system, but also when I'm teaching. When I'm teaching responders, and I say to them, many of you are going to be tempted to want to approach survivors with the sort of the stuff of the just world theory that's in your hearts, and that's understandable. But be careful with it. And that's about as far as I can go, because the rest of it is above my pay grade. But yeah, I can say that my experiences with regard to that were actually very positive, and they were very useful to me when I went through what I went through.
Roger, did it ever occur to you when you were a kid going through the abuse to go to one of those priests and disclose?
It never did. It never did. And it's not because I didn't trust them. It's not
Yeah,
because I didn't think, I didn't have the language, and there was
yeah,
just, it just wasn't discussed. It's
yeah,
so sad.
right.
And that is such a great question. Thank you for asking it. And I'm sorry that, and let me tell you, those men, those of them that are still alive, would be
Yeah,
so heartbroken to hear that. And it wasn't
yeah,
their fault. It had nothing to do
right,
with that. It just, there
right,
just wasn't, the words weren't there.
right. It wasn't anybody that,
Not really.
anybody in a position that you could do that. And
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's interesting for me. You know, Roger talks about the just world theory, and I was always struck by this idea of how odd the question of why me is. You know, when we've gone through trauma and the instinct to say why me, really why anyone, right? And why be shocked in a world where we know there is violence and injustice, when violence and injustice visits us or other good people, loved people around us. And so one of the hardest things for me, and you're right, it did bubble up repeatedly in interviews I had. It wasn't always coming from religious communities, but there definitely often would be a deep desire. You know, we talked about sort of the positive of writing yourself a new story, you know, assigning meaning to your experience. There was in many cases, what I would hear from survivors talking about their experiences with their religious community was that desire to get them to that space. They wanted people that, you know, their communities of faith at times wanted them to get to that space of reconciliation entirely too swiftly.
right at the
That
beginning.
there is, we can believe in the value of forgiveness, although as I understand forgiveness, that's something God does. And we can believe in the idea of living through trauma and finding meaning through that experience. But we have to fundamentally, part of believing in the idea of justice or a just God, for me, is to live that in our individual lives. And that if I believe if I seek justice, I have to also seek for the people around me healing. And part of healing is allowing people to grieve and to mourn and sometimes to rage. You know, there is righteous anger is vital.
Right.
And one of the things that I struggled most with, not so much directly from people around me, but I sort of felt it in the ether, this idea that I needed to move swiftly into the zone of reconciliation with this particular experience, and perhaps forgiveness, and sort of you know, almost a Zen calm about it. And the truth is, we have a right to that anger, and we need the space to express our anger, and we need people who can acknowledge for us, this is an injustice, this is a wrong. It is not a gift. It's not something God gave you. In fact, there's nothing godlike about it.
Right.
And I think part of what happens when people have been traumatized is language that, you know, probably would always strike some of us at least as banal, you know, and reductive. It suddenly, I think for many survivors, feels almost wounding to be on the receiving end of that. Because you really know that someone saying that is not grasping how deep this wound is.
Right, and it trivializes what you're saying.
Exactly. There's certain things that perhaps are part of, they're painful, difficult. You know, lost in December my very beloved stepfather, and that has been a very, very, very difficult thing for me. I recognize that the loss of a parent, or that the life is in and of itself finite, and so as horrible as it was to lose him, that is a certain inevitability. There's an inevitability about that that is different than violence, than events that just literally should not happen. And so, my sense is that we are so desperate, as Roger said, to, in some cases it's very well intentioned, to help someone get to a place where they're okay, that we impose on them language that effectively says, not so much, I want you to be okay, but I need you to be okay.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
There's a big difference. And when you're on the receiving end of I want you to be okay, and when you have that sense of I really need you to be okay because your grief and your anger and you're talking about this and you're addressing this is making me anxious because it's reminding me that there is injustice in the world.
Right.
Threatening the world.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's fundamentally what's behind, particularly in the Christian community, and this is more common in the Christian community than in the other faith communities I've worked with, is this rush to forgiveness. It's not about what you need in terms of your healing or whatever process you need to go through. It's about what I need, and we're back to the listener here, the bystander. It's about what I need you to do so that I don't have to deal with your pain any longer.
Right.
And until we can get past that as communities of faith and be willing to be in that painful place and be, faithfully present to whatever you need to do, I think we're going to be missing the boat around the whole notion of forgiveness. And it not only doesn't help, it hinders people in their process, just as you described it. And that's a whole nother discussion that we might have at another time as well. But thank you both for tackling that one. I think the why questions are classic theological questions. The why me variation on that is, it runs through all the major faith traditions in terms of our trying to comprehend our individual and collective experiences of suffering and injustice. And frankly, from my perspective, there is no simple, easy answer to that. That's part of the struggle of being a human being and living one's life. And whenever we try to simplify that and make it neat and tidy and put a bow on it, all we're trying to do is basically ask you, please be quiet. We can't handle this anymore as a community. We can't handle your pain. So let's, in that regard, let's move to the next slide, Sarah, around language and speaking and truth-telling, which is fundamental to what you're doing here in this project. Are you with us, Anne, in terms of seeing the slide that we're on, truth-telling as part of justice making?
Yes. Would you like me to read?
Yeah, why don't you read from Michelle here?
Okay. It is the absence of language, not language itself, that most often accompanies sexual violence. All truth is good, but not all truth is good to say, says the well-worn African proverb. And Michelle's silence over the years was consistent with such a belief.
So in terms of the silence, but also being silenced by one's community, I mean, clearly in many of the stories that you share in the book, people were real clear that no one wanted to hear about this. That was part of the given, the assumption. I mean, it's part of what you were saying, Roger, is that there was no space for you to come forward, particularly as a young person, and discuss this. Do you think that's changed at all? Have we made any progress on that?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, you think, go ahead, Roger.
I think we've made progress. I think there's a lot more progress to be made. But talking about Lady Gaga's performance, just a few weeks ago, I absolutely am hopeful. Things are moving actually more quickly than I thought they would. Just watching this community and being a part of this movement for almost 20 years now. Again, I don't want to be overly optimistic. I'm not saying there aren't challenges. There are a million challenges, but I do think there's hope. And I do think people are breaking barriers, and I owe this greatly to movements that came before it. The women's movement, primarily, I think, more than anything, just the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s, which sort of gave birth to the victims movement. But in general, people just have a lot more courage and a lot more places, and a lot of things. The movement of technology, the creation of internet platforms that didn't exist before. But in general, I think the trend is a good one in general. I think it's positive.
Yeah, I think Roger's right, and I think one of the challenges is that what's good about what's happening is that you do have a lot of people out there modeling for others what it means to speak openly, what it means to be a victim, how we can still have agency in our lives and ownership of over our own storylines. I think one of the risks is when you have those forms of media representation is that survivors' stories are complicated and nuanced, and most people don't kind of fly out of their experience as the super survivor who can walk onto the stage at the Oscars or come out and share their story in a book like this one, or even feel safe sharing their story necessarily with their own family or community. And there still are these subterranean and subtle ways. What we're fundamentally, I think, as a society, we're uncomfortable with different specific issues, and people's experiences with trauma and loss. But I think as an umbrella, what we're most uncomfortable with is people's pain, their vulnerability, their moments of weakness, and issues that are unresolved. We're much better as a society at dealing with someone who we like to think has put their trauma in the rearview mirror. So we are fine. Most thoughtful thinking people are not going to hold it against someone who comes forward and says, I was a victim of sexual violence. But a higher percentage of people have a very hard time when that experience with violence or trauma, when they're confronted with the day-to-day repercussions of that violence or trauma. And they find ways to kind of silence, very subtle ways to kind of cue, as we said earlier in the conversation, I'm not quite comfortable with that, I wish you'd get it together, shouldn't you be over this by now, all those cues. I think that is not necessarily, it may be in some cases specific to the issue, but I think it's a way in which, you hear it in this current presidential election to some degree, we like, in quotes, winners in this country. And we need to get comfortable with the notion that there are traumatic experiences that render people vulnerable, and that confronting those vulnerabilities and facing those vulnerabilities can call us to go to complicated places, and it certainly calls us to be closer to other people's grief. So what I hear often is that people feel more comfortable talking about themselves as being a survivor of sexual violence, but still sometimes feel uncomfortable talking about the real implications of what that means in their life or has meant in their life. Does that make sense?
Well, and I think it takes us back in some ways to where we started in terms of what is the hearer, what's the response of the hearer, and the whole bystander experience of, if I really listen to your story and let it in to my life, it's not only sharing the pain, it's asking something of me.
Yes.
And I think that's where, you know, people have we all have a difficult time going there, because it's like people don't know what it's asking, but they know it's asking something. But whatever it is that is being asked, that I have to actually do something about what you're sharing with me in terms of engaging in social change, you know, working, you know, in the field, changing legislation, you know, whatever the action is. I'm challenged to do something because I've heard your story, and I think
Right.
that's one of the reasons that some folks just don't want to go there, frankly. But I think we have to go there, because otherwise, you know, this all just keeps going. But I do want to get to this last quote here, because this was one of the places, as I was reading the book, that I nearly threw it out the window when I was reading this particular story. This thing about in the trial, that the defense attorney successfully argued that Tori, who was the victim, should be restricted from using the words rape, sexual assault, victim, and assailant during her testimony, pointing to a 32-year-old law barring terms that pose the risk of unfair prejudice, confusion of the issues, or misleading the jury. And then you go on to report that the judge instructed her to say that she had sex or intercourse instead of using the terms rape and sexual assault. I lost it at that point. Roger, maybe you can help me with this, but it just was beyond comprehension to me that this woman could not even tell her story using her own language of what actually was done to her.
Well, I mean, the only thing I can say is when it comes to the very brutal process of criminal litigation and the hair splitting that's involved with testimony and what triers of fact are allowed to hear, in other words, what jurors are allowed to hear, there are all sorts of strange things that occur. One of my favorite quotes from a courtroom drama, it was about 25 years ago, but I remember the defense attorney saying the reputations quickly give way to the skill of the practitioner once the doors of the courtroom are closed, meaning that what goes on in there is so totally different and sometimes seems so totally divorced from what is decent and what is commonsensical that it can really be maddening. But I don't have a very satisfying answer to this. The only thing I can say is, depending on the type of case and depending on what it is the victim is attempting, or the complainant, I guess is the most neutral term, is trying to express, there are ways that defense attorneys can seek to block certain words or terms that they believe are overly prejudicial, and that's not going to change. I could go on and on, but I can't, because we're running out of time and it's way beyond the scope of this. But here's the one thing I will say. As unsatisfying as this is, and it is, what I always tried to remind victims that I was working with in the criminal justice system, and what I try to remind people when I'm working with them, either survivors or responders, is, remember, first of all, we don't really have a criminal justice system. That really is a misnomer. We have a criminal adjudication system. This is the best we can do. It's very biblical. It's very, very deep in our culture. Which is not; those are not bad things, but they're limited. They're limited by Judeo-Christian notions of right and wrong that often collide with mental health and other things. It's just highly imperfect. So what I would always remind people is, please, 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 never confuse the criminal adjudication system or that process with healing and with what is really justice, because healing is a completely different thing. Justice is a very lofty concept. What occurs in the criminal adjudication system, it's the best we can do, and it should never be confused with those other much, much more lofty and important goals. And that's not easy because we look to the criminal justice system. Hey, that's the public will. That's it, right? Isn't this what we build these beautiful courts and we hire these people but no, that's not what it does. It doesn't heal and it doesn't provide justice. It provides an adjudication that hopefully keeps society sort of calm and moving, and that's all it does.
Well, and you're inundated with these messages, and certainly in the last 20 or so years, where you watch Law and Order, all these different shows that kind of conflate those two things, right? So people go in thinking that there's going to be, this is the culmination, and then there's that, if you're one of the rare people who actually see their case go to trial, that there's going to be this, that almost never happens to begin with, but there's going to be sort of this triumphant ending and then resolution, reconciliation, boom, bang, done, get off the elevator, walk back into your life, and you're a hero. We don't live in TV.
Right.
And so I think it's I think that expectation exists. I think this is the only thing that comforted me in this particular case is I think this was just a particularly troubling, symbolic case, but I certainly have not seen something like this over and over again in terms of language. But it did say something about a way in which we want to literally disappear people's stories, and language that speaks to truth is seen as hyperbolic, and in that way I was very interested. I was interested in her story also because of her resistance to that. How this clearly really galvanized Tori, and she saw it, as Roger said, she recognized she was never going to get justice through that system. That was, she certainly was not going to get healing, but she wasn't even going to get any form of justice. And she kind of made peace with that and shifted her focus elsewhere.
Right. Unfortunately, she had other settings in which to, use her own language to describe what actually was done to her. But I just thought it was just the most outrageous denial of her reality to make that kind of requirement of her in any setting. But and I understand the limitations, Roger, that you certainly experienced within that system. And again, you've talked about that in the quotes that we have on the screen at this point. So we're going to have to go to our closing because our time is up. If you go, Sarah, to the last slide. And this is in your conclusion. That's the thing about social change. It benefits the next generation and the generation after that until someday it's no longer recognized as change at all. It just is. I thought that was a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Well, I think I was trying to look down the world and envision a place where these battles have been fought long and so hard that at some point the world has shifted, and that there's the residue of the fight, but the layout and the look and feel of the world has been so completely altered that we don't think we're a changed society. Again, the Reverend King's notion of the arc of the universe bending toward justice. And I think that is, for me, where I think when Roger mentioned earlier many of the changes he sees, I see really terrific change around these issues. I like to imagine a time where this violence doesn't occur. It's hard for me to imagine a space where we've eradicated this violence. What I can imagine is a world where the vast majority of our citizens respond differently to it, where those ideas of shame and blame start to slowly fall away. I can absolutely imagine that and see that. And I don't think, you know, I think with in any social justice movement, if you're not in it for the long haul, you're not going to stay in it because you're not going to see all of that change. If it's a significant enough social injustice, you are not likely to see total change in your lifetime.
Right, right.
You just aren't, unless you're really at the tail end of something. But we're not, right? We're not, you know, when it comes to this
issue. We're not there yet.
Yeah, and so you kind of have to have that longer view. And I take a huge, and that longer view kind of reminds us that, you know, we measure social movements by those large and lofty goals, but we also measure those social movements in our day-to-day lives, you know, in the ways that we see change, that we ourselves are changed, and we see the people around us change. And every day I see signs of those that change. I also see signs that we have to keep passionately engaging in the struggle, but you see signs of change.
Yeah. And you and Roger and everyone in your book are important parts of that, and the Voices and Faces project, which people will have a link to here if they want to explore that. So let me just close first with a profound thank you to both of you for your time tonight, and I think a really rich conversation that we've been able to have. I hope it's been useful to those who've been listening with us. And one of my favorite quotes, one of my few favorite quotes from St. Augustine, who's not someone I quote frequently, but one of the things that he did say was his opinion that hope has two daughters, courage and anger. And I think in the work that you all have done and continue to do, thanks be to God for that, and may you continue with courage and anger to be a part of the hope that is part of our work together. So thank you, and good night to everyone. And Sarah, is there any last minute instruction about what people are going to get?
Yeah, I just want people to know that I have attached the PowerPoint here as a handout, as well as the discussion guide that the Voices and Faces project provided for the book. So those are both available to download, and then you can get to all of these links there. And that our next book is going to be The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich, tentatively July 20th. Please join us for that. And as we close up today, take a moment and fill out the survey and give us your feedback. And this was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much to Anne and Roger. And have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Marie and Roger. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Good night.